Welcome to Deciphering Growth, the show that explores mental health from every angle. We bring you conversations with personal opinions, stories, and practical tips. We aim to break down the stigma and help you live your best life. So please sit back and let's dive in. Before we begin, we want to remind our listeners that this podcast represents the opinions of Tiffany Graves, Eric Stone, and the show's guests. The content here should not be used as medical advice. It is for informational purposes only, and please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. This podcast should not be in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing a standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. There is no guarantee regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient relationship.
All right, guys, welcome back for another episode. This is a very, very special episode. We have Audrey with us today. She is the founder of Fire Lotus Therapy. I'm going to shove it over to her and let her talk about her specialty and what it is she does.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, guys, for having me today. I'm a little nervous. So I'm the founder and owner of Fire Lotus Therapy. It is a private practice in Cincinnati. I specialize in eating disorders and body dysmorphia, as well as trauma. I'm an EMDR trained therapist. And I work with individuals mostly. I do some family work. I'm married to a first responder, so I've started kind of dipping my toes into that group of people. I love teenagers and young adults, so it's really where my bread and butter is, if you will. And with today's podcast, I've kind of started diving into the world of ADHD. One, as somebody who is just diagnosed within the last year and a half. I'm just seeing a lot of clients with that recently. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. This is going to be so much fun. All us ADHD therapists keep finding each other. There just must be an energy, an aura of sorts. So that is very cool work, and we can't wait to hear about it. So Audrey's prepared, guys. She's listen to us, which I'm like, oh boy, so we'll see what we have. But Tiffany, where do you want to start today, Tiffany?
Oh, where do I want to start? I want to dive right into it. I'm going to hit you with how did your personal experience with ADHD influence your decision to specialize in working with individuals with ADHD?
You're getting it right there. So as I said, I was diagnosed about a year and a half, 2 years ago when I was 32 years old. So obviously I've been a therapist. I've been working in mental health since I graduated with my undergraduate. And I really came upon it, honestly, through COVID. I was like, oh, I know this is like a time that we're all going through, we're all struggling and trying to figure out the work from home balance. And I was working in a hospital at the time, so we didn't really necessarily work from home. But as time progressed, I really was struggling a lot with all kinds of different symptoms of ADHD, which I'm assuming, jumping into here soon. But I already was seeing a med provider. I am diagnosed as well with PTSD. And so I know you guys mentioned it in your previous podcast about ADHD, how sometimes trauma symptoms can very much mimic ADHD symptoms. And it was a very long, drawn out process of making sure, was this just like anxiety parts of, my PTSD that were inhibiting me from progressing? And we tried various different medicines and different types of therapy. I saw different therapists. And then finally I was like, okay, let's try a stimulant and see, does this help? And it did. It was life-changing. I after a few days of taking it, I checked in with my med provider and I was like, is this what real like normal people feel like? Is this how their brain works? Because mine is, always going and always doing these things and I'm all over. And now I can actually pick out thoughts and feelings and actually be like, oh, okay, I can focus on this or I could do this. And there's so much more to that. But so through that, I really started a deep dive into what is ADHD and what is it like to be an adult diagnosed with ADHD. Because we do know that most education that we received in our various programs in the DSM talks about you need to be diagnosed pre 12 years old. But as a female, I don't present as similar as my male counterparts, if you will. So I really have dove into all this research and I just kind of started getting some clients that had ADHD. It was just very happenstance of like they came in already diagnosed and some had, your quote unquote textbook presentation and some didn't. And I'd be like, okay, so let's really explore this. And I've really developed a passion throughout time working with females because, the eating disorder world is predominantly female. That is not to say that men or males do not also deal with eating disorders or body dysmorphia, because they very much do. And there's not nearly enough research or support out there for males. But with females, as I said, we don't present necessarily the same way as your hyperactive little boys, right? And so that's such a long drawn out story, and I apologize, but that's really how I got into this world of like, okay, like let's figure this out. And what's interesting, and I've done a lot of research under oh no, I meant to write his name down because God knew I was going to forget it, but I think it's Richard Barkley. He popped up on my TikTok one day, which I know sounds really hilarious. It was somebody who had like recorded one of his talks, and he was discussing like the genetic component of ADHD. And I was just like, tell me more, because you don't see that talked about. And I do believe that family history is such an important part of our lives, for better or worse. And so, then it was like, okay, when I meet with clients and they're like, well, yeah, like my dad has it or my sister has it. And it's like, your chances are so much more likely that why aren't we looking into that? My nephew has it. My brother has it. My son most likely has it. He's going to get tested here soon. My husband has it. So it's like, I don't know. So that's long story short, how I got into where I am and my passion for it.
It's gripping.
Yeah. It's always, what's the word? English forbays me in the morning. It's always kind of interesting though, how like we as therapists tend to find our way working with things that are always personally connected to us somehow.
Yeah, definitely.
I appreciate your courage, Audrey, just coming on being so honest, because I think like it just breaks that barrier down for other people seeking a therapist, because I think sometimes there's like this pedestal that people sometimes feel that we are on. So I just appreciate your honesty about your own journey with mental health, like the layers of it and how it's just like this natural kind of flow that you've been on to get to this point where you're working with who you're working with and kind of going. And so I felt like that was a great amount of time for you to talk because it's so gripping. Like I'm just like, yeah, like keep talking. Like I want to hear more about how you got to where you are. It's just so interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I do pride myself on being, not like every session I meet with somebody, I'm self-disclosing things about me. That's not the purpose. But I do think, as I know you guys know, like mental health has such a stigma still, and you would hope that'd be different in the year 2024. Who knows? But I think it's really important that people know that we're not perfect and we struggle too. And I like to be, as open as I can in an appropriate, ethical way with people and saying like, yeah, there's a reason I love to do this. Maybe because I've been afflicted, maybe I haven't, but I think it just gives an opportunity for people to feel more comfortable being vulnerable too.
Yeah. You said something, Audrey, that I found really interesting about like how we're trained in our programs and then like about ADHD and we don't get enough support. But I feel like what you're saying right now is not something we're normally taught in our programs. Like, yeah, like I just remember in my graduate program, it was like almost any disclosure at all was like horrible, and like you needed to fill out like a 50-page audit on yourself versus like appropriate disclosure. So maybe just because I think it'd be interesting to hear from someone that's not Tiffany and I. Like, how did you get to that place where like you knew what you're comfortable sharing with clients and knew when it's helpful for them? If you feel okay to answer that.
Yeah. So I think there's a little bit of truth to why most of us get into this field, right? I wouldn't say all of us have suffered things and that's why we do it, but I knew from a really young age, I wanted to help people. So my mom died when I was 8, and I spent a really just tumultuous time growing up and figuring out how to grieve and not grieve, because we don't live in a country or a culture that really allows grief to be felt the way it should be felt or could be felt. And then, to save my kind of trauma timeline for you, there's a slew of other things that just happened in my family from high school to college. And I found that when I was in therapy for myself, the way I felt the most connected is if I felt like the person I was talking to could share a little bit about themselves. And I don't need like anybody's life story, and I don't expect my clients to want or need my life story either. But we're asking people to come into our offices or come to us via telehealth and say, okay, tell us your deep dark, like tell me everything. And while we don't expect that to happen in the first session or maybe even the first few, I find that there's a better connection when it's like, okay, like this person has experienced life too. And they maybe not the same kind of life. And, I always say that, like, no matter what, if you came into me and said, hey, my mom died when I was 8, I wouldn't say, oh, we're the same, right? We experience life so differently. And to be able to say, God, I can't imagine what that was like for you, because I know, that was something that was really hard for me. So I wonder, what was that like for you? And sometimes, that can be that building block of like, oh, okay, I can be vulnerable with this person. And so it is, yeah, like you said, I remember being in grad school and then being like, self-disclosure is terrible, and I just remember thinking like, I feel like we have a really big ask of people to be authentic and vulnerable if we can't be authentic and vulnerable. There's definitely been times where I've cried with my clients. Of course I try to keep my, I don't sob, but the things that are really moving, whether it's been, I have a client who just really overcame so much with like her eating disorder and her body dysmorphia. And now she's in this place where she's succeeding so well. And I remember crying with her during that session of us talking about how far she'd come, right? Or, there's another time where somebody was, telling me something really hard and really terrible. When they can see that we have empathy and not sympathy, I think there's just such a better connection there.
Yeah. And I think too, it goes to speak to the level of like humanizing our profession as well. I mean, we're taught to be almost robotic in a way in school and like be like, we're very clinical, you're very this. And it's like, that's not warm, that's not welcoming. And being able to like connect on that level and like share experiences in a way that is connective based so that people can be like, oh, like I'm not alone.
Yeah.
This person is here to help me in a way that like other people just haven't been able to.
Yeah.
I think we all are just like in a different energy sometimes. And I think our clients come in, and I think that's like, I love how you said that, Audrey, because people are coming not because we're perfect, but because we're real and we've lived life and not the same thing, but can relate. And that is where like the healing can be done. And so I think you say it incredibly well, just the process and why and how, yeah, it's very uncomfortable for a lot of people to not know anything about someone, not know all our business, but not know literally anything about us or how we're approaching it. I think that comes up in a lot of different settings, whether it's a consult or a first session or a terminations. I think it shows up everywhere, like how comfortable you are and that level of connection.
Yeah.
So with working with our ADHD clients, Tiffany and I have talked a lot about this, Audrey, but like how do you typically start with your clients, or how do you typically make a plan with them, kind of working as like an adult living with ADHD or a newly discovered ADHD diagnosis?
So like in the sense of like how do I do it as somebody with ADHD, or how do I approach somebody with ADHD?
As a therapist, how do you start with your clients that are like maybe new to the discovery of their ADHD diagnosis? I know it's a very broad question and it's
Gotcha.
different for each person, but just maybe in general, how do you like to start with your folks?
Yeah, definitely a very general approach here of kind of asking them like, what do you know about ADHD? What are your thoughts about ADHD? The the most like the teen, so I work with teenagers mostly, young adults and adults. And so when I get teenagers who come in with ADHD, like they already know, like they've already been diagnosed typically by somebody else pre coming to me. So typically I'm saying, okay, what does that look like for you? What is, are you taking medication? Tell me if it helps. Like, how do you know it helps? You kind of give me that rundown. With my young adults or my adults, sometimes it's me saying, I feel like something's a little spicy, if you will, right? A little divergent in how you approach things. Have you ever heard about ADHD? Have you ever thought about ADHD? Kind of where does that go? And of course, this isn't in my first session. I mean, sometimes this is my first session, but I'm never diagnosing something like ADHD in a first session. Typically, I like to take a few sessions at least to say, okay, do we want to pull out the adult, self-report checklist to see where you fall on that? Do we want to look at the DSM criteria, etc.? And then I kind of like to say, so if it's somebody who comes in with that diagnosis already, I say, what works for you? Like, I don't know about you, I don't like somebody telling me what to do. I really struggle with that. So if somebody comes in and says, here, Audrey, here's your goals, I'd be like, who are you to decide that? Right. And of course, we always want our clients to pick their own goals. But I like to say, are you, I have a person that I work with that very perfectionistic. Okay. So how would that work for you when we're making goals and making objectives for those goals, right? Do you like it to be very measurable? Or are you somebody like me that's like, we'll see, like we'll aim for that. Let's try, right? And then, but I always put in, or I tell them like, hey, I think a goal for us together is education. Because I still get these people who come in who say like, yeah, I was diagnosed when I was a kid. I've been on, Vyvanse since however long, or Concert or whatever. And I say, okay, what do you know about your ADHD? And they're like, well, I don't know. Like my mom just said I was super hyper and I wouldn't stop talking. Okay. There's so much more than the hyperactivity or the inattentiveness, right? There's the sleep issues, there's the food issues, there's the sensory issues, there is the, emotional lability. There's just so many other pieces that aren't in the DSM, aren't even in that like adult checklist, right? That I feel like people really don't know or understand. And it's definitely something that, like, as I was doing my own research for myself, I thought I didn't feel like I fit the DSM criteria per se. But as I kept reading and researching and listening to people like Dr. Barkley, I was like, wow, I've had some of this stuff since forever. I've never been a good sleeper. I've always had some textury issues with like food or clothing. If you can call my dad right now, he'd be like, sister was so sensitive to everything. Like I was told when I was a kid, like, Audrey can't take a joke. Like Audrey's so sensitive. Like, well, yeah, it's called rejection dysphoria, like, right? Or rejection sensitivity dysphoria, excuse me. So all these other pieces are like really what puzzled it together for me to be like, oh yeah, this is it. And the clients that I get, or the parents, right? Like I work with teenagers, so I work with their parents too. I love being able to bring a parent in and say, how can I support you? And I'm like, golly, in the evenings, they're so moody, they're so angry, they're so whatever. I like to say, okay, let's talk about what ADHD is. So coming back to that piece of like education, because I think understandably a lot of primary cares or pediatricians are diagnosing or providing the medication, but that education piece is so lacking. And it's like, hey, did you know this is like an aspect of your ADHD? So when I have an adult that says, I have a performance review coming up for a job, okay, let's talk about the anxiety that's coming up there, right? And then talking about how does anxiety play a role or depression play a role in ADHD? Because those are very comorbid. And so chicken or the egg is the thing I always like to say to people, like, did you have anxiety first or the ADHD first? But they go hand in hand and they will wreak havoc. So let's learn about it. Let's talk about it. So yeah, it's all about exploring for me in the beginning. I really want them to tell me what they know or what they think or what they have questions about, and just kind of going from there. The benefit of private practice, and I am a self-pay practice, so I don't go through insurance, is I don't have to have a treatment plan today. I don't have to have a diagnosis today, because it's time to really delve into like, what does this look like? And
yeah. Something that crossed my mind as you were talking about the way that you handle ADHD with your clients and things of that nature really made me curious. Do you have resources that you've either found personally or through your work with ADHD that you would recommend to people who maybe aren't quite ready to take that step into the therapy realm?
Yeah, great question. You guys referenced this in your last episode, but like, not TikTok, like just not TikTok. I love TikTok, y'all. I love it. I'm a millennial that's obsessed with it. I have a personal channel. I have a therapist channel as well. And as a reminder, I have it in my little bio, like TikTok is not therapy, TikTok is not diagnostic, TikTok is just people. Anybody and everybody could be on TikTok. People, like my dog could be on TikTok, right? Like
maybe they already are.
Now,
I don't know.
I mean, shoot,
Oh.
she's a feisty little golden retriever, so she probably is. Actually, I am training my dog to become a therapy dog, so I might make her a TikTok for that. But
Oh, that would be cool.
I know, right? Anyway, so it's really just so I can bring my dog to work. But
preach.
So obviously, like in a session, I'm gonna look at the DSM, of course. I'm gonna pull up, like I said, that adult self checklist. But I really, really love attitudemag.com. It's like ADDITUDE mag.com. We can probably link it somehow in the podcast, but it has a plethora of information. And now I'm like, is it a .com? Is it a .org? I don't know. So it has so many different topics, and it's honestly where I send a lot of like education to parents about, where I'll say like, I've got I have a teenager who's been like I said, has been diagnosed, but nobody's really done education. And I say, okay, this is why it looks different in a female, or this is what rejection sensitivity dysphoria looks like, or they do have like they have a symptom checklist on there. I think they have the adult like self-report checklist. They've got a couple of different things, which I always say like, hey, try it out, and caution, right? An online test is not a diagnostic, right? Unless it's provided by a therapist, a doctor, a nurse practitioner, whoever, where it's something like the Beck's anxiety scale. Sure, I send that out to my clients to help get an idea where their anxiety is, but it doesn't mean, oh, you have an anxiety disorder, right? But I think it's just a really wonderful resource. And then, like I said, Dr. Richard Barkley, I really hope that's his full name because I've just said it multiple times now. He's featured on there a lot because I think he helped create it. He's retired, but I have found some of his presentations that I just think have been very great and very engaging and informational, because he does talk about like there's just so much more to ADHD and like how the DSM really kind of fails us in that like diagnostic criteria of things that should be a part of it. But
I love that you brought up TikTok, Audrey, because I also am a millennial that loves TikTok far too much. And it's something I'm more spicy about. Like Tiffany will tease me that we should have soapboxes for me, but it infuriates me the amount of people self-diagnosing ADHD for very typical life feelings and energy. Like, oh, it's 8 degrees.
Put a finger down.
Yeah.
Put a finger down if you don't like how tags feel on your skin. Put a finger down if you get overwhelmed with lots of tasks. Put a finger down. You have ADHD. And I'm like, no, that's okay.
It's so frustrating. I think also just like it relates to like when we talk about trauma, it's like you could have a few of the symptoms or on like a slice of them or a piece of them, but it doesn't mean you have a full-blown diagnosis. And so I think it's just I'm throwing because I love our discussion, and like for those who are having it or finding out, I just think it's like I don't know, I feel like we're in this, I don't know what it is, and maybe it's something we could talk about today, but just this idea that like we have to have this diagnosis, and once we have that label or diagnosis, then it's a validation of what we've experienced versus like the diagnosis doesn't change maybe what's happened to you. It can be really great to know an answer, but I almost think people I don't know. I don't know if it's like, oh, if I have this diagnosis, then you have to be nice to me about how hard it is for me to focus. I don't know. I'll open it to the two of you, but it seems like there's something more there underneath of why people want that diagnosis so severely.
Yeah.
Even if they're not maybe fully a part of it.
Yeah. I think you guys had talked about this. Basically, I'm plugging your podcast for you and your last episode as well of like when we were, I was in grad school and I went to this is kind of funny. When we would do like, we would get a case vignette and it was like, okay, diagnose this person off of like 2 paragraphs. And I remember being like, it could be this and that and this and like, but those 2 things count, and I do remember I was aware I had PTSD before I started my master's program, but I do remember going to like a symposium about trauma, and I texted my husband and I was like, wow, I got a lot of issues, because I'm listening to these things. And granted, I did have that diagnosis, so full disclosure, but it was like one of those like, oh shit, like and that's what actually propelled me into getting EMDR, by the way, just a little plug there for EMDR. But yeah, I get frustrated as well, like, because, we all have things. We've all experienced things. The way we do things, sometimes when somebody comes in and tells me a behavior, especially like when I work with people with eating disorders, and they'll tell me something that like is kind of weird to me. But then I say, well, do your parents do that? Like, do they eat like that? Or do they make those choices too? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay. So sometimes our behaviors are learned and have nothing to do with the diagnosis, right? Or, on the flip side of that, like you were saying, I tell people like a diagnosis isn't going to change your life. Because, let me caveat that a mental health diagnosis.
It's hard. I know this is a hard conversation to have. So I definitely understand why you're like, ooh, let me give context. It's a very hard conversation to have,
so
I think.
Getting a diagnosis of like MS is life-changing, right? So many things are going to change in your life for so many different reasons. Getting a diagnosis of bipolar, for instance, is going to give us an idea on if like a certain medication might be better for you or a certain type of therapy might be better for you. But that's kind of where it ends, in the sense of you don't get to go, like you said, and I say this to my clients and I say it to their parents all the time, you don't get to go home now and be like, well, I have bipolar, and so when I'm manic, you just have to deal with it, right? Or I get irrationally angry sometimes.
It's okay. You're talking to me, so you can feel whatever you feel.
Yeah.
You're allowed to feel what you feel. Don't permission for me.
The people in my life know it. They know it. But I don't I'm allowed to be mad, right? Like I'm allowed to get angry about stuff, but that doesn't give me then this like right to like say, well, I'm mad and you have to deal with it because this is like a symptom of my ADHD, right? No, that's on me to say, okay, Audrey, what do you need to do right now to help with this? Like it's okay that I'm mad, but it's not okay that I'm going to damage a relationship, or it's not okay that I'm going to potentially lose a job, or, whatever. I have to look at myself and say, okay, so, I tell my clients this all the time. They all know I'm a little angry bird. It's okay. Because I tell them, listen, and especially with like coping skills, right? A coping skill of walking away from me, golden. When I'm angry, I literally need to go cool off. So, I tell my husband, like, I need a minute. I gotta walk away, or even like, I'm a toddler. Well, he's not a toddler, but I just want him to still be a toddler. He's 5, but he ticks me off, right? And I'm like, okay, don't get irrationally angry at the 5-year-old who doesn't have logic. So I'll say, buddy, I need, mommy needs to go take a second, right? And I'll go and I'll, whatever it needs to be after that to cool down. And then I come back and say, and here's the big part here. Hey, I realized I got really angry about that. Can we talk about it? What was it that made me angry? Was it something that, maybe something hurt my feelings or something came up? Okay. And maybe it was me being like, I'm sorry. Like, it's okay that I got angry. And I'm sorry if I said anything inappropriate, because that's not acceptable. I'm sorry that, maybe you were trying to have a conversation with me and I had to walk away, but I'm back now. I'm cool. I'm calm. Let's talk. Because it's a big pet peeve of mine when people say, I have this, that's like cause and effect. I have this, so I can do this. And it's like, no, because it's unfair of us to ask other people to cater to us, especially if we won't want to cater to them. So,
Audrey, we need to have you back on the podcast because I love your fire and anger. We may get you one of those soapboxes if we make one, because it is infuriating. And as a couples therapist, it blows my mind how people think one person's stuff trumps someone else's, and whether that's the patriarchy or all types of other stuff. But it blows my mind when people think that a mental health diagnosis is like a card to play to act how they would like in a situation. Now, can we, like in an individual therapy session, say, hey, you know what? Like that is probably some of this. Let's work on it. We can grow. Yes. But there is some folks that are not in that mindset. And they're like, well, I have this to deal. And it's like, that doesn't hold up in court. You don't get to punch holes in public places and do whatever you would like to do. It doesn't hold up. And there's this disconnect. And I think sometimes as a therapist, I get a little honestly afraid for some folks I've worked with, where there's just this huge disconnect about like, yes, should we be mental health and trauma informed? Absolutely. There is a certain extent that we're like that, there's only so far we can go with being informed. Like I just think of like legal spaces or safety spaces, right? Like, you cannot just go in everywhere, have access because your feelings are lining up a certain way. So yeah. Tiffany, what do you have? I saw something on your wheels turning.
Oh, I was just agreeing in terms of like there is that sense of like society is breeding this we're obligated to things that we want, and helping people recognize that like we're not obligated to shit. we not to say that we don't have access to things, but like there's a certain level, there's a certain line of like, this is where like your obligation stops and this is where other people need to be considered. Like you can't just go willy-nilly walking into the courthouse like, hey, I'm here to argue my ticket. Like, no, like that's just dumb.
Yeah, you're not entitled to a job. You're not entitled to a bank loan. Like I like to try and put that into other kind of, sometimes I think it's hard when I'm talking to teenagers or young adults where they're like, my parents just don't get it. And I'm like, I mean, fair, they might not. But here's the thing. I want you to be successful. I want you to be able to go and have a job. And if you get angry at your job, to chill out before you, lose it on your boss and then say, oh, sorry, I didn't take my medicine today. And your boss be like, oh, that's okay. Because a boss doesn't have to care about that. So I try to put it in those like real world experiences more than
Yeah.
just like relationships too, because mom and dad should hopefully have to love you, right? Because they're your parents. But your boss doesn't.
Mm.
Your college roommate doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something even outside of ADHD that I notice on occasion is that people that transition from like high school to real life is such a shocker that people are like, oh, like life doesn't actually function this way. And I'm like, yeah, no, sorry.
Mm.
That was just a pipe dream that you were living for the last 18 years. Life is now officially started.
Mm.
Welcome.
And I think, I mean, that just speaks so much to, unfortunately, our education system and other things too. Of it's such a
Yeah.
sheltered world. I mean, in this, we don't want our
Mhm.
teenagers or young children to be exposed to certain things. But then, I think the biggest joke for people my age, it's like, did I really need to learn the Pythagorean theorem? No. Could I have learned maybe how a credit card actually works? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or I don't know if you guys encounter this, but like so many people get frustrated when we go through the education piece of like boundaries and understanding emotional and emotional intelligence. And they're like, why the fuck was this not taught in school? And it's like, don't ask me. I'm not an educational congressperson.
Right.
I mean, I have this very powerful memory with my individual therapist because I am in school. Like I went back to school to do some stuff, and so not therapy. And I remember like talking about this dream with my individual therapist. As an adult, I finished my master's, and I was like, yeah, I'm so stupid because every time there's a test, like my brain shuts down, and I can't think and I can't study, and like my therapist was like, you're not stupid. You're getting overwhelmed, and your brain is shutting down. Like that's not a stupid issue. You need to learn how to go. And I honestly was like, no one at any point in my entire education system, like all of high school, a whole college degree, finished a master's, no one ever thought, and we're in a mental health program, and I just like, how in the world does no one go over, it's just, it kind of blows. So I think I'm just like, wow, I had that with a master's in counseling. No one ever told me that, but then I'm in an individual therapy session and someone's like, hey, have you ever just thought about this that way? I'm like,
Nope.
never, not once. Not a single time. I just convinced myself that I'm like whatever it was, whatever the meaning is. And so I don't know if you guys have had any epiphanies like that for yourself or for clients, but I just remember it hit me like a ton of bricks when I got told that.
Yeah, bringing it back to ADHD. Look at me. So I kind of mentioned this to you the other day, Eric, like being diagnosed in my 30s, and this is something I also see an individual therapist, which people are always shocked by. I'm like, no, that's great. We should be doing that. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah. We would be crazy if we weren't.
Yes.
Right. So, one of the things we talked about is like the grief of being diagnosed as an adult and looking at my childhood. And, like I said earlier, on paper, I would not have tipped the scale for somebody to think I had ADHD because school came really easy to me, grade school through high school. I low key hope none of my teachers ever hear this, but, like I did my homework at the, I'm the procrastinator for sure. Like at the very last second, sometimes in the class right before that class, I never studied. And I graduated in the top like 10 of my class. And yet then I get to college and I was like, whoa.
Wow.
I didn't have,
the curtain comes down.
Right. I got a bachelor's in psychology from Ohio State. And I had a minor in human studies and human development, family studies. Yeah, swap those. And I loved college. I loved what I was doing. And I thought, this would be great. I'm doing classes that I really like. But I didn't have the busy work to pad grades anymore. I had like 3 tests and it was it. And sometimes I had papers and things. But again, that procrastination was so key in my life. I didn't know how to study. I didn't know how to do anything. And so I graduated on time and all the things. And I remember talking to my therapist about my GPA at that time, which sounds silly because this was years ago, but I was like, yeah, I mean, it's just like really embarrassing that this is what I graduated with. And she's like, why? And it was like, well, I graduated high school with basically a 4.0 and I graduated college with a 3.0. I just feel like that's so embarrassing. And she was like, you didn't know how to study. You didn't know how to be academic. Like, you didn't know how to do those things. And then like looking back and not grieving where I am today. Like, I'm so happy with where I am today. This is not where I saw myself when I graduated college, but there's a part that's like, man, what could I have done if I knew more about how my brain functioned, if I had a medication that was helpful in the way my current medication is, and there's this grief of like, what if? And while that doesn't support me moving forward, and she, but it is grief. And so it's something like she's had to say to me of like, it's okay to grieve that. And I did the same thing, Eric. Like, I'd be like, oh, I'm so stupid that I just couldn't study. Why couldn't I study? And it was, I'm not stupid. My intelligence has nothing to do with me not knowing how to study or get my brain to like quiet down enough that when I'm in, biology lecture with, 700 other people, that I'm over here thinking about, why is Pluto a planet or not a planet? Like, that's very confusing to me. But we're sitting here, he's talking about bugs. And I'm like, but like Pluto, like my whole life, Pluto was a planet and now it's not.
My life is a lie.
My life is a lie. And then going to like a calculus class, which my brain is not meant for math like that. And then being like, I wonder what it feels like to do this. Like, I mean, that's just kind of where, so yeah. And that is why, shameless plug for therapists, but that's why therapy can be just so great. And I think so many people with ADHD are underserved because it's like, well, you're hyperactive, you just need a stimulant, or you're inattentive, you just need a stimulant. And it's like, medication can be very, very helpful. And there's so much more that we're not told or taught, or, we just type it up, pass it off as like, oh, okay, I take Adderall and everything's fine now, except for when everything isn't fine, because life's not like that.
I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing, Andrea. Maybe like our last, maybe like big point today, just because it's so big. Okay, Tiffany, go ahead.
Tiffany has feelings.
No, I was like, I have a point.
No,
I'm sorry.
No, go.
So I really, really wanted to end today in hopes that you could share a case study or a success story that highlights the positive impact of what therapy can do for someone who has ADHD. So all of those people out there who are considering the option can have a firsthand glance into like what it looks like and what could work for them.
Yeah. I'm gonna use myself. And that's because I do get cautious about sharing about clients that I've worked with or currently working with, because I never want a client to hear something like this or hear a TikTok and think, oh, is that my case? Even though nobody else would know, but it,
no, it's well done.
And so, like I said, of course I'm a therapist, so I have a different approach to it. But honestly, pre my own diagnosis, I knew about ADHD the same way as basically everybody else in the general population. I was used to it.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah.
Elaborate? Yeah, a little bit on like what, when you say general population knows, like what kind of, give us an idea of what like that would look like.
Yeah, so I think when people hear ADHD, I think typically they think hyperactive little boys, right? And very rarely little girls, and definitely very rarely adults. And so like when I've told people I was recently diagnosed, they're very skeptical. Well, are you sure? I'm like, well, got like 3 other providers that are pretty sure. So I guess, I feels pretty right. So I, some of my background, if that's okay, is I worked at Cincinnati Children's on one of their inpatient units. I worked as a direct care staff. I came back after I got my master's to work as a social worker. And so I would see ADHD, but mostly again in males. I worked with teenagers, so always like teenagers. And so when I started thinking, okay, something is not working for me, I was having such a hard time with executive functioning. So I was having a really hard time with, and granted, some of these things I've always had a hard time with, but didn't realize they were parts of like ADHD. Like getting up and like doing things in the morning, feeling like I had the energy to do things. And there's a lot more to it. So please, whoever's listening, don't hear that and think, oh, I have ADHD, because it's hard for me to get out of bed or get up and do something, because that could be so many different things. But I would start getting I would get to work. And when I was doing like face-to-face things with clients, I had no issue. But doing the things that I thought were boring, quote, if you will, I could not get myself to do it. And I would sit there and then all of a sudden, and something we haven't really talked about, I would get into this very like deep shame spiral, this like guilt spiral, where I'd be like, God, why can't you just do this? And why are you so behind? And why are you always so overwhelmed? And then there was like, blah, 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 blah. And I would get down into this place of like, I'm terrible at my job. I'm terrible at my job. Am I good at, am I a good therapist? Am I good at being a mom? Am I good at being a partner? Like it would just really just morph into so much more. And so, as I said earlier, I went to my med provider at the time and I was like, something's not working, like something's wrong. And, I will say too, like full disclosure, I am one of those people, unfortunately, that's gone through quite a few different medications since I started medication. I think part of that is growing and maturing. I had a pregnancy in between all these things. COVID happened. There's so many reasons why medications sometimes, work for us and then stop, etc. Another time to talk about that. But, and this doctor was like, well, I think it's just anxiety. And I was like, oh, sure. Okay. We'll go with that. I didn't know if it was ADHD because it felt very like weird as an adult to say, oh, do I have this? Because everything I'd ever read as a therapist was like 12 and under, you should have a diagnosis. So we tried about 3 different anxiety medications on top of what else, like the other things I was doing, and nothing worked. And I went to see a therapist and I was like, well, something's not working for me. And so they recommended I do EMDR. And I was like, okay, great. Like we all know I have the trauma. That's okay. Let me go. So I started doing that. And it was definitely helpful for me in other aspects. But while some aspects of my life improved from like doing the EMDR and really going into like a lot of these negative core beliefs I have about myself, the other part of my life didn't change. I still was having a lot of issues at work. I was still having a lot of issues it sounds like gross, like getting myself to take a shower. Like I shower, okay, guys, but like I don't want to. I don't like showering. Once I'm in it, it's great, I guess. But like getting myself to be like, now I have to get wet. I have to like get cold. I have to do like I really struggle at getting stuff like that done. Brushing my teeth, telling myself to do that, which feels gross as a 30-something-year-old woman to say like, I don't like showering or brushing my teeth. I do them, but it's work. Finally, I'll be very frank. That provider did not want to discuss anything else with me besides anxiety. So I went and found a second opinion, not a different doctor to say, give me a stimulant, but found a second opinion and said, hey, these are the things I'm struggling with. Here's the medications I've tried. I just, I want somebody else looking at this. Take a peek. What are your thoughts? And we met probably 2 or 3 times before I was meeting with the therapist, also going through the same like motions of like, here are my symptoms. Here are the things I'm experiencing. Here's the emotions that are coming with it. And so after a few sessions with both a medical, like a med provider and with a therapist, it was like, okay, let's try a stimulant. I actually had gene site testing done. So you had mentioned this a little bit, Eric, in your first episode about ADHD so just, a little spit swabby in my mouth. Med providers are back and forth on if they believe the validity of gene site. It was actually very helpful for me personally. So we started me on a medication and it was a trial. It's not, I didn't just start taking one medication. It was like, poof, I was great. Like it was a trial figuring out, for instance, there's stimulant medications and they're non-stimulant medications. And then there's, these medications that are short acting or they're long acting, and trying to figure out how that worked. And when I finally got onto this med regimen, it was like, wow, okay. And like I mentioned earlier, okay, so I had the assistance of a stimulant helping me, like when I got to work, it helped with some of that overwhelm. But then going to see my therapist, seeing this person and saying, okay, like I think things are kind of getting better. And then really deep diving again, like I was saying, into the education of it. Like, hey, tell me about other symptoms. Like, right. So I've always struggled with sleep. I've always been a poor sleeper. That's a huge symptom of ADHD, right? As a female, there's a big I don't think comorbidity is the correct word, but it's very common for females to struggle with PMDD, right? Premenstrual dysphoric disorder with ADHD. And that's because of the luteal phase and all kinds of things that we can get into another time. But that was something I was diagnosed with at 18. Then there was, I've always been this sensitive person. Like any kind of feedback, when I was applying to jobs, it was like, what are your strengths and weaknesses, right? And I'd always be like, I'm open to feedback. But really, I would go home and cry. Or I would be like, I'm my world's worst critic. Like, you could say I did something like not great, and I will go home and berate myself. Like, don't worry. So all these things are coming up, and it was like, okay, so how do I now, knowing these things, address them? How do I cope with them when they come up? How do I create coping mechanisms for my anxiety that I definitely have, or my depression that I also definitely have? How do I deal with like the mood swings? So something that not a lot of people know, like a stimulant medication can help with mood lability or like mood swings, which is great, and can dull down our emotional responses. And so once that medication wears off, it's like, wait, why am I feeling everything so much more? Well, yeah, because the medication wore out of your system.
That is a beautiful, like, just example of like a case. And I think I appreciate, Audrey, like your honesty, your vulnerability, and just sharing, because I think this for sure is going to help some people, whether it's like a therapist or a client. So I mean, truly, like, I don't think I've even put that much out there, and it's me and Tiffany here a lot. So just want to really like just take a moment for those who are listening, just that like Audrey's put a lot of great stuff out there, sharing from her personal wounds and experiences and repurposing that for growth. So I just want to make sure to thank you, Audrey, for sharing all you've shared today, because I've been learning stuff, and I just appreciate that vulnerability you've shared.
Yeah, thanks guys so much. I feel like I talk all the time, every time. So thanks for letting me go on my little tangents and stories. I promise I won't make a TikTok video.
We definitely are going to have you come back. No, we definitely, there's things that I want to hear more about. And so I think we'll just have to find another time for you to come back, because it's just gripping. I think that's just the best word I have. It's not even because you're on our, you're talking, I'm like, just hanging on to it. So I would love to, we'll have to figure that out. But I want to throw it to you, Tiffany, if there's anything else you wanted to throw out this today.
No, other than just, we really appreciate you taking a time out of your day to join us and to, educate the general population on like both your professional and personal experiences with ADHD. And like Eric said, hopefully we'll squeeze in some time and get you back here sometime soon.
Yeah, that would be great. I would love to come back. I'd love to talk about eating disorders for sure. Or EMDR or IFS or, life.
All of it.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Deciphering Growth. We hope you found our conversation helpful and insightful. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. Don't hesitate to contact us on social media if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.